Welcome again, listeners to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live globally, of course, www.rnb.org.au. Our program is Innovation Talk, and I'm your host, Michael Lester. By any standards, the higher education, particularly the university education sector in Australia, has made huge and valued contributions to the development of this country, to our economy and our society. It's now an enormous undertaking. Among many OECD countries, we've probably got among the highest rates of university education in the workforce, could be over 50%. And the numbers of people involved, some 1.5 million people enrolled. And we've got over 40 universities, mostly public, but 2 or 3 private ones, publicly funded universities. Huge business in many senses, revenues around $35 billion. They ran into a few problems that became evident to all of us at COVID, which revealed some of the perhaps structural faults and weaknesses in our conceptualization of both the role and the business model and approach of universities when during COVID, of course, there were huge staff layoffs and drop-offs in revenues because of falling off in student enrolments from overseas in particular. So perhaps it was no surprise that when the Labor government came in a couple of years ago, they announced what the minister described, Jason Clare, the Minister for Education, as a once-in-a-generational opportunity to reimagine the Australian higher education university sector and to draw up a blueprint, if you like, for the next 30 or 40 years. A very bold undertaking, and we're now seeing some of the elements of that review process being implemented through legislation. I'm delighted to welcome to our program Andrew Norton. Andrew is the Professor of Higher Education Policy and Practice at the Australian National University, including formerly with the Grattan Institute. So delighted to welcome Andrew to Radio Northern Beaches. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Michael.
Andrew, why was it necessary from the government's point of view to put in place such a major inquiry with such big aspirations? What do you think might be underlying objectives?
Well, this was actually a promise in the 2022 election campaign. It was actually made by Tanya Plibersek when she was the shadow minister. So the current minister, Jason Clare, inherited this idea. I think what Plibersek originally wanted was, a more stable policy environment. She had these aspirations that there will be, some agreement between the government and the opposition to create a stable system. And in some ways, I think it's under Jason Clare that this, in some ways, becomes something much bigger. So the terms of reference for this review came out late 2022, and they were incredibly broad. Almost everything is up for grabs. And in some ways, I think that has caused a lot of problems in this overstretched the Accord panel.
They have completed their report, I believe, with a big swag of recommendations, as you say, across a very broad range of endeavours. One of the things, perhaps, that really got highlighted through the COVID pandemic was the fact that the universities were so reliant on overseas international full fee-paying students and their revenues. I believe that overseas students were numbering around 500,000 out of the 1.5 million that were enrolled at the time, or might be now, and bringing in huge revenues, 10 billion out of total revenues of 35 billion. What in particular has the government now put in place to change the nature of the funding model that has prevailed for so long?
Well, really at this point, the only major thing it's doing to kind of reorganize funding is actually these caps on international student numbers, which will basically stop the growth in international student numbers. On the domestic side, the minister hasn't really been successful in getting approval of additional government spending through the Expenditure Review Committee of Cabinet. The only really major thing he's achieved so far, and this was a recommendation of the Accord, which was to change the way we index outstanding student debt. So right from the start of HECS in 1989, it's been indexed to CPI. Because CPI had been low for a long time, kind of no one really thought about this issue. Then, of course, we had this post-COVID inflation spike, which caused huge controversy. So there's currently a bill in the Parliament that will say that indexation will either be CPI or the wage price index, whatever is lower. And that's going to mean that the last 2 indexations are going to be backdated to lower levels. That's going to cost about $3 billion in terms of reduction in total debt. But most other things the minister has done since he came to office or in following on from the Accord have really been mostly driven by offsets from other education programs, or even, the more than doubling of the visa application fee for international students. The minister said that money was going to go towards some Accord-related matters. So it looks like he's really struggling to convince his colleagues to cough up significant amounts of money.
The structural nature of some of these changes to foreign student participation seem almost counterintuitive and maybe slightly even inconsistent with past practices. I mean, governments have always encouraged the universities to attract full fee paying overseas students, and this has led to a major source of revenue, as I say, 10 billion out of some 35 billion. And in particular, it's sort of cross-subsidized other activities within university, including arguably research, and in part against a backdrop where governments were increasingly finding it hard to keep up funding to universities. What's the nature of this change that they're making or propose to make to international student participation? They seem to want to cut it back, which seems to potentially exacerbate the problems.
Yeah. So in fairness, I don't think Jay Sinclair came up with this idea. I'm sure this is a higher level decision that migration is a political issue the government needs to manage. And because international students are the sort of single largest category of net overseas migration, it's hard to avoid tackling that issue. So effectively what we've had, since this market started decades ago is an open-ended system. Basically all people who meet the migration criteria are allowed to come to Australia to study. Now, the actual migration criteria have been changed over time, and some of these changes do lead to fewer students coming. So it's not as if government has totally ignored this. But I think what they've decided here is that even though they have made, on my count, 8 or 9 changes to migration to reduce student numbers, I think the reality is that particularly the Chinese students aren't particularly responsive to these migration changes. And so I think the government decided that actually capping their numbers at each education provider is the only way to achieve their migration policy goals.
It's quite a heavy-handed regulatory intervention into university handling of student enrolments and acceptances, or not?
Yeah, it's huge because they've all got very used to growth in this space and growth if the demand is there. And they've also got a whole lot of bureaucratic aspects to this, which are really complicated because the way international students are admitted is not like, say, school leavers, where they're you all apply through one of the tertiary admission centres and then there's an orderly kind of set of offers. This is a much more constant process. And because the students often apply to multiple universities, including universities not in Australia, the universities don't have high visibility of what else the students are applying for. And so when they send out these offers, they don't really know how many responses they're going to get. So trying to manage this to a precise number is going to be extremely difficult. And I don't think any of them quite know exactly how they're going to do it. And it could lead to things which I regard as totally unethical, which is that they may even have to cancel enrolments after they've already happened because they're getting too close to their cap.
So does this suggest this setting of a cap, which is 270,000 for 2025, that this might not even be a realistic sort of cap and might not be achieved and achieve even what it's supposed to be trying to achieve?
I am very confident that the actual final number will be way below 270,000. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is there's an issue with double counting. So a lot of students, international students, start in one course, say my English language course or a diploma, and then articulate into a university course. And they will be, if they're in the same year, they will be counted towards the cap of both those institutions that have offered those courses, even though, of course, it's only one individual. That 270,000 includes the vocational education sector as well. We can see from the Department of Home Affairs visa grants that their offshore applications have completely been smashed by other migration changes. So I think as a sector, the vocational sector will really struggle to actually meet their caps. And so I think the actual total number is going to be way below 270,000.
There are changes proposed, aren't there, in the Record report? As I understand it, the broad thrust of that is, again, to reduce the flexibility of universities a little bit, it seems to me, in that the past systems were sort of set for domestic students by dollar amounts to universities and not by trying to limit places. But I believe that there could be a move towards specifying places. Is that right?
That's right. So this is quite baffling. So they want to set up this new organisation called the Australian Tertiary Education Commission, ATEC for short. And in a consultation paper they put out a couple of months ago, and this is actually following on from an equally mysterious Accord recommendation, is they want to put hard caps, sort of full-time equivalent hard caps on each university. Now, under the current system, we've got what I call soft caps, which is, as you mentioned, they're allocated a block of money, and they won't be paid more than that no matter how many students they enroll, but they will still get the student contributions above that limit. And so that means they do have marginal funding for each extra student that they enroll. And talking to university leaders, most of them aim to slightly over-enroll. And this is because they see themselves as quite demand driven, that if, students of the requisite quality are applying, their instinct is to take them if they can. So what a hard cap will mean is that they'll probably be shrinking their student numbers so they don't end up with students which they're receiving no funding at all. And given the Accord also, wants us to increase the number of people going to university, this really doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me.
There have been attempts trying to influence the market and the choices by students about what sort of disciplines they're studying in by changing fee structures broadly, for example, to make STEM, science, technology and engineering and mathematics disciplines presumably more attractive while making it more expensive and presumably less attractive for people to sign up for the arts and humanities. But what's behind this sort of thinking? And is that sort of thinking continuing through into the Accord and the options being discussed by the current government?
It is, but with an important difference to how they go about it. So the previous government, their job-ready graduates policy, effectively, as you're alluding to there, set high fees for people doing arts, basically as a signal, a deterrent signal to doing these courses, which have below average labour market outcomes for the graduates. The current government has said they do want to reverse that, and for the student charges, go back to something like what we had before job-ready graduates, which was some rough relationship between the student contribution you pay and the likely earnings of someone with a degree in your course. Where I think they kind of will pursue this kind of job-ready logic is actually on the supply side rather than the demand side. They're a little bit unclear on this, but this Australian Tertiary Education Commission is going to have as one of its function national skills planning. And so that implies there will be some mechanism to steer the system in the direction of courses where the government thinks there'll be demand in the labour market. But unfortunately, they'll hit the same problem that job-ready graduates has, which is that effectively people will only do courses that actually interest them as a course and as a potential career. And my theory here, and this is kind of lots of international literature on this, basically people have interests. And they can have multiple interests, so it's possible they can be swayed within their range of interests. But, if you've got your heart set on doing a creative arts course, no one's going to persuade you to do accounting instead. It just doesn't work that way. Where I'm worried about where the government is going is really the only real mechanism they have is capping at the course level, which basically stops people doing that course. So we've had these hard caps in medicine, no other course but medicine, for a long, long time. And the government has quite effectively stopped tens of thousands of people doing medicine. But that doesn't mean these people will do the courses the government wants. And so what I've been arguing here is, and again, this is working against their participation goals, is effectively what we'll probably have is, student places allocated to the universities, but they can't fill the places in those courses. And so as a result, again, the total number of students will fall well below the theoretical maximum funded level.
Our guest on Community Radio Northern Beaches Innovation Talk is Andrew Norton. He's Professor of Higher Education Policy and Practice at the Australian National University. We're talking about some of the big reforms that are underway to universities. They're funding an operation here in Australia as a result of a big review called the Universities Accord. We used to have, didn't we, a demand-driven system, student demand-driven system of university funding, which was designed to respond to both the demand for university education and to do this in a way that would maximise participation in universities. What's happened to that model, and how does that model fit in, if at all, to what's going on now?
So we had that officially between 2012 and 2017, though there were a few years before where the caps were quite relaxed. So we sort of started around 2009. So the research I've done shows that applications tend to move in the same direction as the labour market for the occupations, particularly where there's a lot of information out there that the potential students might be hearing. But there are always kind of limits on this because of these interests that I mentioned before. But we do see, so during mining boom, engineering goes up, mining busts, engineering goes down because it's kind of reliant on the mining and construction cycle. We see bursts of, interest in health. So during COVID, there was a big increase in interest in health courses. So it does broadly respond. And the universities, in turn, reflecting what I said earlier, do try to accommodate that demand. Often the big constraints on responding to demand, particularly in things like health, are the all these courses have compulsory clinical placements, and there's simply a finite number of those clinical placements, and that is kind of acting as a sort of different kind of hard cap on the numbers in those courses. But in my view, the demand-driven system was by far the most effective and fastest way to let the system respond to changes in skills needs.
One of the other objectives that seems to have assumed a large priority out of the accord, and I think in the government responses and actions, is to increase participation for equity reasons of disadvantaged socioeconomic groups and others, including ethnic and indigenous people. How do some of the changes that are being proposed to the funding models that we're discussing going to impact on that objective?
Ironically, I think it'll probably be a negative. The reason for that is that often the people from these backgrounds, haven't done fantastically at school. And what we see is when the number of student places goes down, the people who haven't done as well at school tend to be the ones who miss out. And so if universities are reducing the number of student places, then that will have adverse impacts on the equity groups. On the other hand, I think the government will also probably try to impose targets on the universities to recruit equity students. And they are promising some additional funding for these students as well. So that may change university behaviour. But I would still be very concerned that if the universities are being restricted in how they can respond to demand, that will be negative for all applicants, but probably particularly for the equity applicants.
It does seem that it's a much more highly interventionist regime, if you like, that's being brought into play for whatever reasons, that tends to be reducing the degree of university flexibility in trying to match supply and demand of the courses that they're offering. They used to have, I believe, quite a degree of flexibility too outside enrolment numbers through what was called HEX-only over-enrolment places that they could put in place. Is this a mechanism that's still going to be available to provide a degree of flexibility or not?
No, and that's kind of what I'm talking about with the hard cap, that
right.
The soft cap is, you won't get full funding for the additional ones, but you will get the student contribution. And talking to universities, this student contribution is very important to their operations. And if you think about it, they've already got their economies of scale. So if you've already got your buildings, you've already got your curriculum done, all those kind of fixed expenses, and you can fit a few more students in, that is typically going to cost much less than the average funding rates. That's why they can economically over-enroll in the student contribution only. And it just seems to me to be crazy to stop this happening. It's letting more people go to the university they want to do the course they want to do, all at reduced effective cost to the government because they're not funding the full rate. So I just cannot see why they are doing this.
If we could turn to the research component, universities, of course, have the important teaching and training, if you like, a component, but they're huge contributors to the research base in Australia and the standing of Australian research and science and ultimately through to innovation. There's been a big boom over the last 20 or 30 years in university research, I believe, which might be running at about $15 billion a year, if I'm not mistaken. Only a small proportion of which, it seems, maybe, I don't know, a third or something, might be funded directly by the Commonwealth to the universities. But the funding model in recent times has relied on funding research being held up and coming from foreign student revenues. To what extent is now in this new funding regime and outlook this research-based funding being put into question?
I think the loss of profits on international students will have an impact. The figure you just cited is the Australian Bureau of Statistics, trying to calculate how much expenditure occurs on research. Then what I've done is look at sort of all the specified public and private research funding sources, and that leaves about $6 billion, which is not explained. Some of that would be discretionary donations and investment earnings and things like that, but there's no way to explain this level of expenditure other than through profits on teaching, the vast bulk of which would come from international students. Now, I should stress the number of international students, if universities can manage their targets, will still be fairly high compared to, say, a decade ago. So it's not as if we're looking for total collapse, but we are seeing the end of growth that will have significant implications for the research output over time. We're already sort of seeing this in kind of declining rankings because we've had a tough few years with COVID as well.
Traditionally, the funding models, I believe, basically included money for combined teaching research on the premise that good teachers needed to be across their research areas and that these were sort of joint positions. But increasingly, I believe, and is this right about where we're going in the future, that the funding for university staff and whatever will be trying to make a distinction between teaching only and research only and in a sense, impacting on that traditional nexus?
Yeah, so I think this has been happening incrementally over a long period of time, but the Job Ready Graduates Policy, which started in 2021, created new funding rates, which were supposed to be essentially teaching only and some associated student support services. And so that is a further blow to the teaching and research employment model. So if we go back way in history, 30 years ago, most of the university's income was a government operating grant, and that was explicitly in the legislation for both teaching and research, and that supported the whole idea of teaching and research employment. But over time, the funding streams have separated out, and so now we've got many more research only and teaching only staff. And in my view, the teaching and research model has kind of been propped up by the international student profits, which has enabled more people to stay in this mode of employment than would have been the case if it had a fully publicly funded system. But again, with the international student market having questions over it, that's another strain on that particular mode of academic employment.
Another trend in this research area has been the tightening up of research funding universities through the Australian Research Council, a major body funding research. Of course, this has had the effect that relatively few of the people who apply these days, and probably lower than any other OECD countries, are even successful in gaining access. But at the same time, too, there's been a big increase in pressure on universities and their move towards industry collaboration and maybe industry funding and joint projects. This seems to be having an impact on the nature of the research that's being done, not only in terms of the areas and disciplines that might have commercial payoff, but a shift from what fundamentally is the university research role in the basic end towards a much more applied commercial end.
Really, governments have a very utilitarian view of what higher education is about. And so that has meant, multi-decade policy pressures to steer more of the university research activity towards applied. So that's affecting both the nature of, say, these Australian Research Council grants, where particular grants where you've got industry partners can get funded. And then for the block funding, which is this research support program, how much money the universities get from that program is based on a formula where about half of the formula is external non-government research industry kind of income. So it's really incentivized universities to get this industry funding, because they both get the industry funding and it means they get more of the public funding as well. So that's had a very profound effect on the nature of research. And you could argue that in some ways, industry should be doing its own research, and the distinctive role of universities is really at the more basic end of the research spectrum.
Another fundamental problem that was highlighted through the COVID period with university structures was the working and employment conditions of university staff and teachers and researchers. Of course, initially the huge job losses and what have you, but increasingly we've seen the complete casualisation of the university teaching workforce with the precariousness that brings, and a lot of other potential implications. Is there anything either in the Accord process or in the government's responses and actions that shows any concern or interest in trying to do anything about the working conditions and employment conditions in universities?
So there have been changes not flowing from higher education policy, but from broader industrial relations policy, which is going to put limits on fixed-term employment. This is already in effect, and also making casual employment more difficult. So in some ways, this is already backfiring, because universities have been told sort of not to give regular hours, because that will not be casual employment. And so now kind of people are being put on, short, 1 or 2 weeks notice of random hours to avoid the casual employment, to ensure that they are classified as casuals, because otherwise they might have to be put on the official payroll. So kind of it's one of those things where probably well-intentioned legislation in some ways is creating greater insecurity. The universities are also creating more part-time jobs, which is good for the people who get them, but not good for other people who might have done casual work at universities, such as, say, PhD students. So this could have some negative implications, particularly with the domestic research students, where the numbers have been going down in recent years. And I think a lot of that is due to the living cost issues. Scholarship's not high enough. And if your chances of earning additional money as a tutor or something like that are being diminished, then that's going to exacerbate the issue with domestic research students.
An issue that's arisen too in thinking about universities and the commentary on them is the question of value for money generally, of the public money, but also the associated dimension of the standards within universities, both in the face of increasing numbers and then decreasing funding for universities and casualisation of the workforce. There have been a range of questions around standards, everything from cheating and dropout rates through to the problems of trying to deliver to huge classes with few people who perhaps not fully and able to do it.
So the Accord has various ideas around both curriculum and teaching, particularly around teacher training, which I think all other things being equal, is a good idea. But I think there was one idea that, everyone have a graduate certificate in higher education teaching or something like that, which sounds good, but again, limits who can be a university teacher. And if you've got to do, a 6-month certificate potentially at your own cost before you're allowed to be a tutor, then that will have obvious effects on the supply of tutors. So there's kind of a complex trade-off here. Some ways, I think the bigger, more immediate issues we've got around cheating, as you mentioned, thinking AI is, obviously causing universities to have to completely rethink the way they do some things to find modes of assessment that are less vulnerable to the student just sticking the question into AI and then just cutting and pasting the response.
It could be argued that over recent decades, the business model has had big implications for the governance models. One could characterize what's been happening to university as their corporatization. They become bureaucratized, for example. The high salaries that are paid now to many administrative staff compared to academic staff. Are these issues of governance structures and the options about whether universities are self-governed and have academic freedom or even academic autonomy, are these issues that have arisen again in the Accord and are being taken up or not?
There is pressure, and the government is doing this to change the governance arrangements. So effectively what happened was, in the 1980s or early 90s, universities often had very large governing councils or senates, and often various internal university constituencies had a majority in this. So effectively it was a self-governing kind of institution. Various governments decided to reduce the size of these councils and bring in more external people, often people with commercial and financial experience. I think the problem with this has been not that it's bad to have this experience on the council, but they have insufficient understanding of higher education or universities as institutions. I think this is one of the reasons, probably the most important reason why we've had all these $1 million vice chancellor salaries. Because if you're come from a corporate CEO background, $1 million salary for the CEO is probably on the low side. So they think it's completely normal. But for academics, we're used to kind of a different kind of structure. It seems wildly excessive. On the other hand, I think a lot of the things that academics complain about and blame governance on, I think are actually universities responding to the policy structure, and even an institution with more staff on the governing body probably would have made similar decisions because that's simply the logic of the system, what they need to do to manage themselves, given the various laws and signals coming from government.
Pursuing the bottom line seems to be as important as anything else in the mission of the university. Is there any distinction either existing or valid to think about in governance between, on the one hand, a board, might be called an academic board or a senate, or as against a sort of a more business-oriented model and board where you'd have a CEO running the sort of business side, but you'd have a clear stream of academic, collegiate, self-governing.
So we do typically still have academic boards, which will cover the sort of curriculum approval and that kind of thing. But the governing body does have academics on it, but it's majority not. I'm not so fussed whether they're actually practicing academics or not. I just think we need people who have an understanding of how universities operate, where the weak points are, the right questions to ask of the Vice Chancellor and other sort of senior administrative leaders. And I just don't think the kind of people who've been on councils are sufficiently connected to know what's going wrong. So this, casualisation and underpayment, all these kinds of issues, if they were closer to the ground, they'd probably know about these issues and hopefully would have raised them before these turned into major scandals, which I think have, undermined the sector's standing.
Well, as we wrap up here on Community Radio Northern Beaches Innovation Talk with Andrew Norton, the Professor of Higher Education Policy and Practice, the Australian National University, do we think there's a sort of clear concept and reimagining going forward of the role of universities and their contribution and how they should be funded in government emerging?
I think the desired direction is clear, and that's for a much more technocratic, centrally driven kind of system where it's designed to implement the government's goals rather than the more autonomous kind of system we've had in the past. But there's still a lot of detail to be filled in. So these major issues we're discussing about how do you actually distribute student places between courses, an absolutely vital issue where I think the signs are towards micromanagement, but we don't yet have confirmation of that. And we don't know that the Senate will ever actually pass a more interventionist model into law.
Thank you very much, Andrew Norton, for joining us on Radio Northern Beaches.
Thanks, Michael.